Here's what's coming up today on the Prove Me Wrong podcast.
My argument to just for all of it is to eliminate it, to eliminate college sports, because there's no way of fixing the system. It's so broken and it's so corrupt. The only way to fix it is to destroy it.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Prove Me Wrong podcast. I'm your host, Pete Lieb. I'm flying solo today, but I do have a guest with me who's going to be coming on today, and we're going to go down Conspiracy Road a bit today, or as my guest might say, Skeptic Avenue. We're going into the world of sports, and let me paint a picture for you just briefly before we get started. I assume everyone here who's listening today are sports fans, and I'm sure you found yourself wondering, what the hell's going on here? You're watching a game, the officiating has been horrible, star player has suddenly lost all his ability. You jump up and you shout, "This game is fixed." I know I have. It's kind of usually we shout it out as in frustration, but we don't typically believe it, since millions of men and women around the world live and die on the performance of our local sports teams. But our guest today on the program is here to tell you that when you think the fix is in, you might just be right. So joining us today to shed some light on the topic is Brian Tuohy. I hope I pronounced that name right.
Brian? Yes, you nailed it.
Awesome, thank you. Brian is recognized by the U.S. Supreme Court as a scholarly authority on game fixing in sports. Brian Tuohy is not beholden to corporate sports media world. He is the author of the highly controversial sports book, The Fix Is In, the showbiz manipulations of the NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, and NASCAR, also larceny games, sports gambling, game fixing, and the FBI, as well as A Season in the Abyss, sports gambling versus the NFL's integrity, and his most recent work, The Fix Is Still In, More Corruption and Conspiracies the Pro Sports Leagues Don't Want You to Know About. Tuohy has also written for Sports Illustrated, Vice Sports, and Sports on Earth, among others. He is an in-demand radio guest, having appeared in over 200 radio programs and podcasts across the United States and Canada, including the nationally syndicated programs The Dan Patrick Show, Coast to Coast AM, and Alex Jones. He can also be reached on his own website, thefixesin.net. But today, he is talking with us, and welcome, Brian.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Pete.
I appreciate it. So, Brian, just real quick, kind of if we could get a size of the problem to start, because you're certainly not suggesting that every athletic contest is fixed, right?
Correct. Yeah, I've come at game fixing from two different angles. One is the gambling end, where you have people like potentially shaving points or throwing games for gambling purposes. But I also come at it, which nobody else does, is from the manipulation end of games being fixed, which would be the leagues themselves messing with their own games, altering the outcome of certain games to make sure certain storylines and certain stars prevail, because they know their bread is buttered basically on the media end of this, and they need the television ratings, they need the money from those corporations, and therefore they basically tweak their games as need be to get the best ratings and most profit they can out of television, because that's where they make all their money.
So, again, I'm from Ohio originally, and while I'm a Cleveland fan, I was always wondering, in terms of like the Cincinnati Bengals, and I'm just trying to get an illustration on what you're saying there. I always wondered, the Cincinnati Bengals are 8-8 every year. They're just good enough to be bad, right? Once in a while, they'll throw a 10-6 in and they'll make the playoffs, but typically they're just good enough to be bad. And so you're saying is the money, the incentive for them to be a winner isn't there. Is that correct?
Well, that's part of it. So, with the NFL shares, and no one seems to be able to get an exact number on this, and I've done a lot of looking, but they share at least 75%, if not, pushing toward 85, 90% of all the revenue that the league makes. So when a team goes 16-0, like the Patriots did a couple years ago, and at the same time the Lions go 0-16, essentially both teams are making the same amount of money. So from a business end, it doesn't behoove you necessarily to win games because you're not going to necessarily profit more as a franchise. And at the same time, actually it behooves you potentially, if you're the losing team, to maybe lose a certain game, because then that may propel a team, another team further on, and that's the prevailing storyline this year in the NFL. And therefore, because that's the prevailing storyline, that's what everybody's interested in, that's what people want to see. Well, maybe more people are going to tune in. So really, actually, you're making more money when you lose because a certain team's performing better.
Who are the teams then in terms of the NFL, to start there? Who are the teams in the NFL that we are really, is it LA, New England, Dallas? Are those the teams that we're really pushing forward to be winners?
Well, I mean, obviously New England, is one that
right, exactly,
ad nauseum. I mean,
right.
But what it is, like you say, is I think the NFL has come out, and it came out probably just 10 years ago, and literally said quarterbacks are what drives ratings. Mm-hmm. People want to see great quarterbacks do their things, and I think the league has actually manipulated its own rules, altered its own rules to give more offense to the game, more excitement. But I also think they protect the quarterbacks. I mean, obviously, there's been, the roughing the passer calls have been changed. You can't hit a quarterback below the knees, because then that's a penalty. But at the same time, I think the league is instructing the referees, hey, protect certain quarterbacks, protect Aaron Rodgers, protect, Tom Brady. And basically, it allows the offensive line to get away with murder. Because, I mean, the old adage is you can call holding on every play. And even if it's not true, but you could call holding on every other play or every third play, the amount of holding flags, although slightly increased this year, at first, has faded away. If you let an offensive line get away with murder to protect that quarterback, well, guess what? The quarterback's going to do better. The team's going to do better. That team's going to win more. And therefore, that quarterback's going to be in the playoffs, which is what the NFL wants. So, I mean, just a subtle manipulation like that, which is perfectly legal, and that's something I try to bring up every time I'm on an interview, is that there is no law that prevents a league like the NFL from fixing the outcome of one of its own games. There's, nothing legally that demands that they call a fair game. There's nothing legally that demands that, a team doesn't cheat like the Patriots did with Spygate. The league can fix its own games if they want to because it's entertainment, same as professional wrestling. It's the same thing, legally speaking. Professional wrestling, Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NBA, they're all the same thing. They're sports entertainment.
Right.
But that's how subtle it can be. I mean, if you just instruct your referees, hey, protect this player, even in the NBA, make sure LeBron James, Steph Curry have their room to do what they need to do, it does propel a star, but it also propels a team right along with it because it's changing the outcome of a game.
You mentioned Spygate. So when we're talking Spygate or Deflategate, based on what you're saying, you wouldn't think that the NFL would want to release that information or do that investigation against New England because they are one of the, the bell cows. Is that something that they literally had to because, kind of the cat was out of the bag and we needed to save face?
That's what I believe it is. Yeah, I think, it was one of those things where, and if you look at sports media, I mean, the actual amount of investigative reporting that gets done is zero. I mean, every once in a while something comes out that they dug out, but most of the legal problems that these players have all come out because, they got arrested or a police report was issued or something. And the same with both Deflategate and Spygate. That came out not because of investigative reporting, because of someone digging into the league, but because it happened to kind of basically trickle out the back end of everything. So, I mean, and with Deflategate, I actually believe that was an intentional thing against Tom Brady, basically because of the new collective bargaining agreement that the league and the players are already starting to, discuss. And I think that was a power move by the NFL to say, look, we will punish one of and suspend him, which means none of you are above our law. We run this league. It's our league. We own it. You work for us. And I think that's what Deflategate really came down to. I think it was a power play by the league to say, hey, we'll do whatever we can, because it really didn't hurt the Patriots in the long run.
Right.
I mean, it was big news. It got everybody talking, but it really did nothing to the team in the long run.
I think they won the Super Bowl that year, didn't they?
Yeah, I believe that's, I think that's the year they beat Seattle.
Yeah, no effect.
But I think that's what it all boiled down to, I think it was a power play.
When I was reading your book, to me, basketball and baseball seemed really easy to me to influence. Limited number of players. One great player on a basketball team can change the entire game. Miss a few shots. The referee impact is huge. But football always seemed a little bit more difficult to me. And so I guess part of my question was some of the strategies that they use, and I know you've talked about a few of them just now, like owners fixing salaries maybe to keep it low on the smaller markets or bad drafting, things like that. Are those tactics that you have found?
Well, I think, if you take a step back from the NFL and you go to soccer, which is really where game fixing is at its pinnacle right now because soccer's played all over the world. It's the world sport. But we know soccer matches are fixed all over the world, and that's 11 on 11, same as the NFL.
Okay.
And the fixers are so good in soccer that they've been able to actually dictate, hey, we want this game to end 3-1, and the game will end 3-1.
Wow.
They've done it. I mean, it's been proven that it's been done. And I would think, well, how the heck do you do that in soccer? You know?
Yeah, exactly.
But they've done it. I mean, it's been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, there's people all over the world. I mean, like the Italian Serie A soccer league is incredibly corrupt from top to bottom, from ownerships down to the, actually, I think the janitors. And it's been proven. I mean, people have been, arrested and convicted and thrown in jail for match fixing in soccer all over the place. So, I mean, it's possible to do when you have an 11-on-11 game like the NFL, because you can prove it happens in soccer.
Mm-hmm.
What happens in the NFL, for the NFL to manipulate its own games, I think most of it is done through officiating.
Okay.
And I think, when you see, like, you mentioned being a Browns fan and you mentioned, like, the Bengals being bad.
Right.
I think part of that does come actually out of the draft, and it's more accidental. I think the reason why, like, the Browns and the Lions, Bengals have been failures for so long is they haven't been able to actually find true talent in the draft, despite trying. I think they honestly do try. But I think, every once in a while there are players like Aaron Rodgers who can just do what no one else seemingly can do.
I was actually going to bring Aaron Rodgers up because you're in Wisconsin, right? I mean, are you a Packer fan?
Oh, God, no, I hate the Packers.
Oh, well, then never mind. But I was just saying, because that
and it's really because I hate Packer fans. I just can't stand hearing them. That's the main thing.
Because that was my point to it was, especially Aaron Rodgers, that draft, he dropped significantly that draft when he could have been number one pick. He dropped all the way down. I think it was into the 20s before Green Bay picked him up. Or Eli Manning, who was originally drafted by San Diego and then refused to play and got put in one of those bigger markets, the New York market.
But I think, they actually have legitimate talent.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that's something where, you have some of these other quarterbacks who get drafted really high and then flame out like Brian Leaf or Keely Smith or, there's a whole slew of them. I think they literally thought they were talented. And if they had shown that they do have that ability to exceed at this level, then the NFL would, quote unquote, help that team. And I think like the Browns, I think Baker Mayfield actually right now is potentially one of those talents.
Right.
And so I think if he can really show it on the field, then I think the Browns might get, a few calls here and there that they weren't getting before, and suddenly that team's propelled forward. Now, most people staying on the outside will just say, well, the Packers are winning because Aaron Rodgers is really good. Well, that's somewhat true. But then if you watch the games and watch, and see his offensive line literally holding guys. I mean, one year, the year the Packers went 15-1, which was, 7-8 years ago, when they went 15-1, they went 11 games without an offensive holding call against them.
Wow.
11 games without a holding call. Now, you don't think that's the NFL protecting Aaron Rodgers, and because it's protecting Aaron Rodgers is succeeding, and because he's succeeding, the team's winning, so therefore they go 15-1. And that's the same thing I see happening right now with the Packers, is they're getting all the calls. All the breaks are going their way. And you could say, well, yeah, Aaron Rodgers is great. But at the same time, if you're not getting, that drive-killing holding call, or if you're getting a cheap pass interference call that propels you 30 yards downfield, guess what? You're going to do good. That's the way the league works. But that's how subtle it can be.
Or even, I was going to mention that to you as well, because the Packers and the Lions played on Monday night. I think it was last week.
Yeah.
And there were two really offensive hands-to-the-face calls against the Lions that ultimately ended up in 10 points for the Packers. And the Packers ended up winning that game by 1 point. And I know that there were some pretty high-level individuals, some celebrities who were calling out the officiating on that. Desmond Howard, I think, was one of them who was talking about the refs needed to be investigated. Just to your point about in terms of officiating.
And that's exactly it, though. So, I mean, that's when people say, well, the league can't be fixed. This can't happen. There'll be too many people involved, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, look, you see it on your TV at home every week if you're watching this sport. If you're watching any sport. I mean, and the thing is, instant replay was supposedly going to fix all of this and make sure the officiating calls were correct. Well, I've seen it as sure as anybody else has seen it when you watch the replays, which they're actively reviewing, like to see if a guy's inbounds or out of bounds. You can see, well, that guy clearly stepped on the line. He's out of bounds. And then the referee trots back on the field and says, he was inbounds, touchdown. You're like, well, wait, what?
Right.
How do you do that? Well, guess what? Like I say, it's happening right in front of your face, and you're powerless as a fan to do anything about it. And even though people keep complaining and whining about the officiating, guess what? Nothing's changing. I mean, the guys who blew the Rams-Saints pass interference call in the NFC Championship game, those referees, as far as we know, weren't fined, weren't suspended, weren't fired. They're just out there doing their job. And maybe that's because they're not doing their job wrong. They're doing their job perfectly right, exactly the way the NFL wants it. It's just fans don't understand, well, because it's basically kind of professional wrestling. In the football arena, the referee's doing what they're supposed to do to make sure certain outcomes happen.
And that play was so blatant. I mean, it was so obvious at the time for it to be completely missed. And then there was that huge knee-jerk reaction where not only New Orleans fans, but the whole NFL fan base in general was just up in arms. And so they create this new rule, but they're not really changing anything, even with the new rule, where you can challenge it. There's no challenges being overturned.
No, I think there's been one pass interference challenge that's been overturned so far through 7 weeks of the NFL season.
Right, so it's window dressing.
There's been numerous. I don't know how many challenges there's been. There's been like probably at least 15, 20 of them.
For sure.
But come on, seriously? But that's exactly it. That's back to my point, is this is happening right in front of fans' eyes, and they complain and whine about it, but they don't understand, I think, where it's truly coming from, and that's basically the NFL dictating how certain things are going to happen because it behooves them to do so. And I always make the comparison, which seems weird, but when you think about it, if McDonald's had an FDA-approved food additive that they could stick in their hamburgers that would make them taste better every time you took a bite of one, McDonald's is going to stick that in its hamburgers tomorrow because more people are going to eat hamburgers because every time they take a bite, they're going to be like, wow, this is really good.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, this is great. Well, that's what the NFL, the NBA, and all these leagues can do. They can manipulate the games while you watch them to make them more entertaining, even if it's just to keep a game closer than it should be. But they can do that and do so perfectly legally. So as an entertainment entity, as an entertainment conglomerate, as a business, why wouldn't they do that? If there's nothing preventing them from doing this, why wouldn't you do it? I mean, it's really the best business decision to make.
And so you also mentioned something in I believe it was Chapter 1, just regards the NBA and Major League Baseball when we go into those 5 and 7 game series, wanting to make sure that those series last a little bit longer. And you used, again, I'm from Cleveland, so you used that, I think you used the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Golden State Warriors as one of those examples where Cleveland was down significantly. And to the eye, they were not the better team. They were not even as good, not nearly as good. But somehow they started to win games and made it to that 7th game and finally were given that victory for LeBron James. That seemed incredibly obvious to me. Or even before that, there was a Sacramento Kings, and I believe they were playing the Lakers maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah, back in 2002, yeah.
When it's just blatant, you could tell that this game was going to go the Lakers' way. Can you kind of give us a little bit better understanding of why we want the series to go longer and the impact?
Well, it's all, obviously the longer a series goes, the more interesting it gets because basically the teams are, back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a 4-game sweep, when it's 3-0, people are already like, well, I don't care. I think I know which way this is going to go. But obviously, the tighter the series is, the more drama it creates, the more storylines come out of it, the more people tune in to watch it. And it's funny because when I first started researching my first book, which came out 10 years ago, The Fix Is In, I came across this RAND report from the RAND Corporation. And this gentleman actually did an article, whatever you want to call it, back in, I think it was 1969. Believe it or not, and he asked the question, was the World Series being fixed? And he basically was asking in 1969 what I was asking like in 2009,
mm-hmm.
which is, is the World Series going to Game 7 more often than it should be? And he basically cited the exact same things. He said, look, if it goes to Game 7, you have more revenue, even in just the baseball parks. More hot dogs are sold, more parking is sold, more tickets are sold. Then you add on the television, more people are watching TV. And so basically he came to the conclusion, without doing any statistical work yet, that, obviously it behooved the league if the World Series went to Game 7 more often than it should. And then he started doing the statistical breakdown, which involved math, which was way over my head.
Right.
It's been a long time since pre-calculus in the senior year of high school. But his conclusion was, and this was back in 1969, that, statistically speaking, Game 7 had been reached more often than it possibly should have, and his conclusion was essentially Major League Baseball is doing this on purpose. They're creating, and he didn't really get into the hows and whys, but he just said, this is happening more than it should. And when I started breaking down the numbers myself, just looking from the first televised World Series, which was in 1949, through 1989, when the playoffs changed, the playoffs format in Major League Baseball changed. But in those 40 years, the Game 7 happened 20 times. So half the time we were getting a Game 7 in Major League Baseball, and I think the number of sweeps was minimal. It was like, I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was like 5 times. So it was like you always had extra games in the World Series until the playoffs changed, which added, expanded the playoff format, which gave television more games to broadcast in the playoff situation. And then the number of Game 7 started to dwindle back a little bit more, but that's because they had more games to broadcast as playoff games anyways.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's, really suspect when you start looking at this stuff and, again, realizing these are entertainment businesses, and they're literally funded by television network. ESPN gives the NFL $2 billion a year. They give Major League Baseball $1 billion a year. They give the NBA over $1 billion a year. Well, what do they want? They don't want crappy games, boring games, uninteresting stuff. They want something that's going to draw fans in. So what do you do as the league? Well, you make sure that happens.
Well, and you also potentially manipulate the ball so that, the ball flies 10 yards farther. In terms of NBA, there was that golden age. When I was growing up, it was the golden age when the NBA teams were all scoring 120 points a game. And then the defenses got a little bit more aggressive. The Detroit bad boys got a little more aggressive. And then suddenly those numbers came down, and the games were much uglier and not necessarily as beautiful to watch. And then all of a sudden, all these rules happened again, which worked towards the offense. So, people want to see home runs. People want to see high-scoring basketball games back and forth. And so, again, just to your point, you can kind of see that manipulation to make a better television product.
Well, and my friend actually made a good point related to this, too, is actually, too, I think once fantasy sports
absolutely
started to become more popular, that's also when they started shifting everything toward the offense. And like you say, in every league, NBA, Major League Baseball with the juice baseballs, in the NFL. And that also, fantasy sports, gambling on sports makes people watch and tune into games they otherwise wouldn't even care about. But then again, you add to the offense, that's going to get people more juiced up about their fantasy teams, and that also generates interest. I mean, people always come back to that, like Occam's razor thing, that the simplest explanation usually makes the most sense. And, to me, it's like if you have a billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar industry like the NFL, what makes more sense? Does it make more sense to just have it just randomly happen and hope for the best? Or if it's a multi-billion-dollar business, do you really leave it up to chance? Or do you control it as much as possible to make sure you maximize your profits and, eliminate your, liabilities? And to me, the simplest explanation is if you can legally manipulate this stuff, you do it.
Every now and then they'll throw in a crumb. They'll give you a crumb. To me, like the Toronto Raptors winning the NBA championship this year, and over the Golden State Warriors, who were, to me, were just so dominant for several years. It seems like every now and then you get a crumb. Here's something to keep you invested, so that you don't tune out and so that you stay involved. Here's the Cleveland Cavalier championship. Just one of those things that are kind of off the wall. Here's a champion that you weren't necessarily expecting this year. Come back next year and watch again. And then we'll continue this cycle where the California team or the Boston team or maybe the Texas team, something in a bigger market, is winning again.
I think in the NBA that's really true because, you go back to the Jordan era and when Shaq and Kobe were big with LA. There was literally, even though the NBA had 30 teams, there was like 6 teams that mattered.
That's it.
For like 20 years. There was like the Spurs with Duncan and Robinson, the Bulls with Jordan and Pippen, the Lakers with Kobe and Shaq. Maybe you could even throw in the Heat when, LeBron and Dwayne Wade were down there. But there's literally 6 teams that mattered, and all the rest were, who cares? They're just like filler. And ever since David Stern, who I think was the mastermind behind all that, because he was directly related with the NBA, dealing with the NBC, and NBC was the one hyping Jordan to, the end of the world. Mm-hmm. But after he left and the new Adam Silver took over as commissioner, then all of a sudden, hey, look, Golden State, who ever heard of them? Oh, they're good all of a sudden. Hey, Cleveland, they've never won anything. Hey, they just won a championship. Oh, like say the Raptors, who are they? Oh, they won a championship. Oh, right. Look, the Milwaukee Bucks, the Greek Freak, and suddenly the Milwaukee Bucks matter. All of a sudden these small market teams that didn't do anything for 40 years in the NBA are suddenly relevant. And again, is that really just an accident, or is that those owners finally saying, hey, it's time for us to get thrown a bone, and they do it?
Well, let me pivot just slightly here to the NCAA. And I was actually really interested in your story in terms of the NCAA entity itself, the organization itself, how that kind of came into power or lack of power, as you outline in the book. Can you give us an understanding of some back history on that as well, the NCAA and the history of the NCAA?
Well, I always found it bizarre that, when college football started way back in literally the 1800s, that even though back then they said, oh, well, this is about college and our athletes, they hired ringers.
Yeah, right.
Yale and Harvard literally brought in ringers, paid guys to play for their college football team in like the 1800s. And now here we are in 2019, and people are saying, we should be paying these college athletes to play sports. And it's like, well, you have been for literally 120 years. It's just not been done above the board. It's always been done under the table, but it's been done forever. And my basic argument with the NCAA is there's no way to fix this system that they've created. Because, again, you go back 100 years, and there's been corruption throughout the NCAA on all levels when it comes to college football and basketball, which are their two, bread and butter moneymakers. There's been recruiting scandals all over the place. There's been academic scandals all over the place. And, I literally found that I think the NCAA has like an infraction library of infractions. Mm-hmm. And when you look through it, and it dates back only to like the 1950s, but when you look back, it's like every major college program. Every major college program has had a major infraction against it, except for like 10 of them. And the 10 are not powerhouses by any stretch of the imagination, but they're 10, somewhat major schools. I think the most major school that hasn't had an infraction was Stanford.
Right.
But, all of them have. And some of them, the Oklahomas and the Texas, Alabamas, they've had multiple infractions against them where they've lost recruiting power, blah, blah, blah. But it just keeps rolling and rolling. And my argument for all of it is to eliminate it, to eliminate college sports, because there's no way of fixing the system. It's so broken and it's so corrupt. The only way to fix it is to destroy it and then maybe start over.
But then you're also talking about that is, for football and basketball, that is a huge income stream, right? Just looking at Ohio State. I went to Ohio State personally. 100,000 people in that stadium every Saturday. When the basketball team is good, the place is packed. Huge numbers. Everything is Ohio State. The city of Columbus has no professional teams. Ohio State is the professional team, right? So then you're asking them to lose that income stream, right?
But, what are they losing? If you look, I don't remember the exact number, but I think it's at least 45 of the 50 states in the United States, the highest paid state employee is either a college basketball or football coach.
I would believe that for sure. Absolutely.
Well, it's true. So, I live in Wisconsin. So as a taxpayer, I'm thinking, okay, well, I have to pay my taxes, which means part of my taxes are going to paying the college football coach for Wisconsin. I don't want that. I don't care. I don't care that the Badgers exist. I could care less. So why do I have to fund them? And when you think about it, in the United States, the only country in the world that actually has a collegiate athletic program. The only one in the world. You think of the United Kingdom and how big soccer is in England. They don't have college soccer teams. They don't exist.
Yeah, I know when I read that, I was surprised by that. I'd never even thought of it because college sports are so enormous in the United States. You just assume that it's that way everywhere.
But it's not. No one else around the world cares. What they do is, if you want to be an athlete, they have these different leagues. They have like an under 17, soccer league, and they have like an under 21 soccer league. And if that's what you want to choose to do, you go get in those leagues and you play for these smaller cities, like college towns, basically. But it's not affiliated with the school. It's not this, pretense of being a student athlete and the kid's out there because he's representing the school. It's because this kid wants to be a professional soccer player, so that's what he's choosing to dedicate him to. And that's what I would argue the United States should do. If you want to eliminate all these problems, and like I say, you could investigate, I believe, any major college program, football or basketball, and find numerous rules being broken, corruption, and what have you. eliminate it all. And if, Columbus wants to have a football team, well, then they can have an under 21 football team that should be technically funded by the NFL because it should be their minor league system anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And you can call them the Buckeyes and have at it. But don't, give me this nonsense of, well, it's for the college and their student athletes and they're there to get a scholarship and they're there to get education, but they're also there to play football. No, they're there to play football because they're hoping to make it to the NFL.
Yeah, the majority of those athletes, especially the basketball, football, they're not there for the education. Maybe the rowing team, yeah, they're there for the education, but those football players, especially at a school, Alabama, Ohio State, Florida, they're expecting to go to the NFL for sure.
Yeah,
totally.
Or hoping to. I mean, their odds are slim, but they're still hoping to. I mean, I'm sure there are a few. I mean, we shouldn't, broadly paint this picture. I'm sure there are a few who are there to get an education and happen to play football, and even, we've heard numerous NFL players who've gone back to college and finished their degree and what have you. But, I mean, for the most part, the majority of them there are there to play the sport, and otherwise they probably wouldn't even necessarily even think of going to college. And even when they're at college, they're not necessarily going to the class. So, I mean, they're at college, but it doesn't mean they're really going to college. Yes,
right.
It is. So, like I said, that's my argument, is if you pay them, well, now, again, you get into the whole thing when it's like a state school. Like, again, here I am in Wisconsin, a state Wisconsin. So, again, now you're going to start saying, well, we're going to pay these athletes. Well, where's that money coming from? I mean, if it's not going to come totally from, ESPN, which pays to broadcast all the games, well, then are you saying my tax money is going to go to make sure the Badgers have a good left tackle?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't care. I don't care if they have a good point guard or not. I don't want my money going there. But if it's a state school and they're state funded, they're getting state money, and guess what? You're paying for it.
Or if
which
you
I
allow,
think is completely wrong.
Or if you allow EA Sports. EA Sports had an NCAA football game for a while, and I guess they actually stopped it because they were getting some claims from the student athletes, quote unquote, that you're using my likeness, but I'm getting nothing from this. Or you have that EA Sports who's using the NCAA football game. They're paying a portion of if you're in my game, you get a slice of the pie, something like that as well. They want to hide behind they are unpaid, they're student athletes, they're here for the scholarship and nothing else. Can't even sign your own name and get a buck for it. I know at Ohio State they actually had a quote unquote scandal a couple of years back where when Ohio State plays Michigan and Ohio State beats Michigan, they get this little token, their little gold pants. And these players who had beaten Michigan several times, they had these little golden pants. They're just necklaces, pendants. And they were trading them to tattoo artists. And the tattoo artists were giving them tattoos for the pendant. And then that became an NCAA violation. And I never understood that because this was just a barter, right? I was trading you something that I earned for something that you can provide. I don't understand how that is an NCAA violation.
No, and that's part of the problem with the NCAA is they have too much power, and they just kind of, like you say, enforce these things rather
right.
in a willy-nilly fashion.
Yeah, where was the logic there? I don't know.
I agree. I mean, I don't think, like you say, with EA Sports using these athletes' likenesses in their games, I think they should have gotten compensated for that. I mean, again, if somebody stole my face and picture and put it out for something that I had no control over and then we're profiting off of it, I'd want my cut of the pie too. So I don't, begrudge them for that sort of thinking. I just think, again, the whole system is so screwed up that there's just no way to fix it. So the only way to fix it, like I argue, is blow it up because it's never going to go back to the system. Because even if you start paying these kids, and there's all sorts of, well, who gets paid what? Does the quarterback make more than the kicker because the quarterback has a chance to get in the NFL and the kicker doesn't? I mean, there's all these kind of questions that arise where if you decide to pay them, does everybody get a flat fee, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't necessarily mean that college games, which I think the easiest sport to fix in terms of gambling, because right now, especially with the kids not getting paid, it doesn't mean you're going to eliminate that opportunity to potentially have kids shaving points in college games. Because even if they paid, let's say, $10,000 a year, which isn't all bad for playing football, well, if there's guys out there betting $50,000, $100,000, $500,000 a week on these games, guess what? They could still approach these kids and say, all right, you're making $10,000 a year as a college football player. How about I give you $10,000 for this game and you just make sure you don't win by 35? Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure, why not?
That's not
and that's
bad.
what it comes down to right now with college sports is because they're not getting paid, they're just perfect targets for guys who potentially want to go out there and start manipulating games for gambling purposes and make a profit. Because I think I could do it with the amount of money I have in my bank account, and I'm a writer. I have no money in my bank account, but I think I have enough where I could go fix a major college game without too much trouble.
And again, to me, it's so easy in the NBA or NCAA in basketball. I remember watching that game when Kobe Bryant, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, he was just mad at the team, and he decided he was not going to shoot that day. And they lost terribly, and it was all, he was blatant about it. You know, he got the ball and he'd pass it off immediately, and he just wouldn't shoot. But to me, that's how easy it would be for them to fix that game, right? To fix a game in general. Kobe Bryant decides to shoot 20 times versus his normal 50 times, and they lose by 10 points.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, I mean, you know, for my book Larceny Games, I got over 400 files from the FBI through the Freedom of Information Act that no one had ever accessed before. And to make a long story short, what the FBI would repeatedly get in about professional, like NFL games, NBA games, as well as college games, is they would get information that said, you know, this bookie is working with this athlete and they're going to fix this game. And they get this information ahead of time. And then the game would end pretty much exactly like their informant had told them it was going to happen. And the problem for the FBI is that didn't necessarily prove that game was fixed, because even though that athlete had a lousy game, it really proved that he did it, you know, on purpose because of the bookie, because they hadn't really made any connections necessarily between the two. And that's the problem with sports in general, is you can have a star, whoever it be. I mean, Drew Brees, you know, LeBron James, like you said, Kobe Bryant, they can have a quote-unquote bad game, but you don't really know what the motivation is. And that's the problem, is nobody is going to bother to look into the motivation, because there's another game next week, and who cares? That was a bad game. That was last week. Let's forget about it. But what's happened around the world, especially like in places like Europe, where they have all this above-the-board, you know, sports gambling and all these, you know, people betting online and where they can monitor everything that happens, is that they've seen weird things happen. They've seen, you know, inappropriate bets, basically, given the circumstances. They've seen players underperform at the same time to coincide with those bets. Then they've actually flagged it. They've turned it over to investigators. Investigators have looked into it, and it's led to people being arrested and convicted and jailed for fixing games. But here in the United States, nobody does any of that. Nobody cares, especially because for most of the time, sports gambling was illegal and no one was here to monitor it. But at the same time, like I say, we've seen guys, great players, even mediocre players, have horrible games, do horrible things, you know, have a mistake-prone game. You know, you've seen how many times you've seen, like, you know, a tackle get flagged for offensive holding, you know, 3 or 4 times in a game that's just really screwed up the game for that team. But you've seen it, and nobody cares, because they just go, well, he had a bad game, you know, let's see what happens next week.
Yeah, those guys seem much more susceptible to me than LeBron James, because how do you bribe LeBron James? He makes, you know, $40-50 million a year. It's hard to think you can bribe him, but maybe you could bribe Lonzo Ball.
At the same, yeah. Well, and with basketball, you know, if you have control over one guy, you have control of 20% of the team,
right?
Which is pretty big. But even if you take a guy like LeBron James, like you say, well, how would you bribe him? Well, you probably wouldn't bribe him with money. What you would have to do, and this isn't something you could necessarily just decide, well, I'm going to go get LeBron James. But, you know, all these athletes, you know, LeBron James down to the lowly 12th guy on the bench, are people. They're human. And they have problems. You know, they may have a drug problem that nobody really knows about, which we just saw in baseball where Tyler Skaggs died from having opioid addiction. But he had a drug problem, which apparently nobody was talking about, even though it was pretty well known. But they could be, you know, they could have a gambling problem on their own, like Pete Rose did, or I would argue Michael Jordan did.
Right.
Or they could, you know, be homosexual and, you know, be in the closet about it all. There's many ways where you could actually potentially get to a player if you knew some of this inside information and say, hey, dude, LeBron, you know, you are doing cocaine at a record rate here. What if we made that, you know, public? You know, here's all these pictures. Here's a video of you doing lines of cocaine off a stripper's stomach.
Right.
You know, whatever. What if we decided to make that public? Or maybe tomorrow night you just don't play so well.
Yeah,
what do you think?
I'd probably have to miss a few shots, I think, if that was the case.
Yeah, but I mean, that's what it boils down to. Is everybody just thinks it's about, necessarily, well, I'll give this guy $10,000 to go do this. No, it's actually, there's other ways to get to people, and that's the way the mafia has made its money for, hundreds of years. They've found the weaknesses of people, and they've blackmailed them and exploited them to get them to do what they want. But the same thing could happen even with these multi-million-dollar athletes, because there's a lot of athletes like Antoine Walker.
Mm-hmm.
He made $100 million in the NBA. He's bankrupt. Mark Brunell from the NFL, he made over $50 million a year, or $50 million in his career. He's bankrupt.
Right.
Plenty of athletes have spent all their money and gone completely broke, even almost before. I mean, Allen Iverson was basically broke in the last few years of his NBA career. Those are guys you could potentially get to manipulate games.
Or Evander Holyfield, right? He had to continue to box long after his prime was over to just because he was out of money. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's another. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's how you get to people. I mean, you just find the weaknesses, and unfortunately, like I say, athletes. People forget sometimes athletes are people, and they have problems just like the rest of us to be able to get that information. But if you got a hold of it and we're actively seeking it out, well, then you could easily profit from it if you're into that sort of thing. And even, you think about it too, athletes could do it on their own.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like if Allen Iverson, like you say, he's basically broken, or Holyfield, right at the end, if you decide, hey, look, the odds are better that I lose this game, here, my cousin, go bet on this event, nobody knows we're related, and I'll make sure we win that bet because I'm going to take a dive. And
we went into Holyfield, and I would like to touch on boxing, just because I am a boxing fanatic. I always have been. I mean, I watch pretty much every boxing match that comes in, and there are just countless instances. I think the first one I can ever remember was Ray Leonard versus Marvin Hagler. I watched that, and I thought Marvin Hagler beat the hell out of Ray Leonard for most of that fight, and then Ray Leonard ended up being the winner. And that was the first time I was young. I was maybe 12 or 13, and I thought, what is going on here? How did this guy get that victory when he clearly lost? It seems incredibly easy for me mentally to get around the fact that boxing is easy to fix.
Well, any sport, even like tennis, when it's a one-on-one event,
mm-hmm.
if you have obviously one side, you have it.
Right,
it's not that hard. That makes it a lot easier than a team sport where even if you have the starting pitcher and he goes out and gives up 8 runs and gets shanked, that doesn't mean the offense isn't going to necessarily score 9 and blow your, fixed game. But with boxing, it's really easy. And boxing, unfortunately, has a history that's rife with these sorts of fixes. I mean, people forget because, again, it's 100 years ago, so I understand why you forget. But there was a heavyweight title holder named Primo Carnera, which literally, long story short, the organized crime controlled Primo and fixed every single one of his fights. They fixed them all, every one of them.
Wow.
His whole career was fixed. And then when he went to defend his heavyweight title, the mobsters knew the guy really couldn't box. So they bet heavily on the other guy who was an underdog and then let the fight happen as it should. And Primo got his head kicked in, got knocked out, lost the title, and the Mafia cleaned up by betting against their own boy. But it's a true story. It's not, make-believe. It happened.
Well, then you also see...
And, in the 1950s, organized crime controlled boxing. In fact, one organized crime guy, one mobster by name Frankie Carbo, literally controlled boxing across the United States. He ran everything. I mean, he worked in conjunction with 2 guys who actually founded the NHL or helped found the NHL, James Norris and Arthur Wirtz, whose family still owns the Blackhawks today, because those 2 guys controlled Chicago Stadium, Detroit Stadium, Madison Square Garden, and St. Louis's arena. And so this mobster worked with those guys to put on fights in their arenas, but he controlled it all. I mean, he and his partners basically determined who would fight who, when they would fight, where they would fight, and sometimes who would win and who would lose. And then they sold it to CBS and NBC as Wednesday night and Friday night fights, which was the most popular watched show in the 1950s on television.
Mm.
And I mean, to me, it's exactly like the way Dana White runs the UFC today, because he's in control of the whole thing. And they sold it to Fox Sports, and he determines who fights where, when, and why. And I think the same way the UFC controls the outcome of fights, because they got to constantly be building these stories to get people to keep paying for these pay-per-view events and stuff. So they have to manipulate it at certain times. But, I mean, it happened in the 1950s. And, again, without a doubt, proven beyond reasonable doubt, this happened. It was controlled, it was organized, it was fixed, and it was sold to television, and they didn't care.
Well, and I think that
crazy.
Ali Liston example too. The second fight where I still have a hard time seeing a punch there, and he went down, and that iconic picture of Ali standing over him isn't him exalted in victory. It's him yelling at the guy to get up, stop laying there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So people think that,
Yeah.
and they see that, and they think, man, Ali's really feeling it because he just knocked this guy out. He was yelling at him to get up because he knew that he didn't really hit him with anything, and he fell down and just laid there. So I've seen.
And I think.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's a great epitome of boxing is right there, is this iconic photo that I'm sure everyone who knows it can think of it in their mind.
Right.
And yet it's from a fixed fight.
Yeah,
fight
exactly.
Was fixed. The Liston took a dive. And I mean, that's, like I said, that's perfect for boxing. It's a fixed fight, yet everybody remembers this iconic moment. It's like, wow, look at that. Isn't that great? Yeah, it was fixed. It was a joke.
But then sometimes it comes down to referees, right? Because I don't think Marvin Hagler in that instance earlier, the fix was not in for Marvin Hagler. He was fighting to win. The decision came out against him. And I think that's even the bigger thing when there's so many times when, again, it's the eye test. You watch something and you've seen this fight. You've seen the whole thing. You don't have to be a connoisseur or an expert on boxing to be able to see that one man beat another. But then you continuously get these weird decisions. And then the commentators, to their, I don't know if their credit or whatever, they have to try to explain why the one guy who clearly got beat potentially maybe could have beaten the other guy. That to me is just the epitome of you leave there feeling lied to and manipulated.
Well, terrible. You probably were. I mean, I interviewed a guy, his name is Charles Farrell, and he was manager for 5 different world champions at different points in time, different weight classes. But he literally told me, fights are fixed all the time. I mean, it's unbelievable how many fights are fixed. But he literally admitted to paying off judges to make sure certain fights went the way they wanted them to. So, I mean, to think that, these judges, well, we got a judge from, New Jersey and we got one from California. And so therefore they're, observers that have no bias or prejudice about this fight. Well, nonsense.
Right.
Like you say, I mean, you've seen fights.
Absolutely.
Where it's come down to the decision and you're like, wait, what? I mean, I think what was the other one? Tim Bradley against Pacquiao.
Manny Pacquiao,
the first time they fought. And everybody thought Pacquiao won for sure, and they gave it to Bradley. And even Bradley's kind of like, oh, really? Me?
Or,
wow, okay.
Or Pernell Whitaker versus Julio Cesar Chavez way back in the day. I mean, I'm a big boxing fan, and there were just so many times when I've watched fights and I thought, wait a minute, Pernell Whitaker clearly won that fight, and they called it a draw because they couldn't get around giving Chavez a victory, but let's make it a draw.
Yeah.
Because wow, he's got to save face. He's undefeated. He's 98-0 or something at that point, and he was trying to get to 100, but he clearly got beat. It's almost enough to make you not watch in some cases because you just don't know. You can't believe your eyes.
Well, and like you say, unfortunately, boxing has a clear evidence of it happening forever, happening for 100 years. So, like you say, why would you think that everything now is suddenly, after 100 years of corruption, why would people think suddenly, well, now it's on the up and up?
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, things cool now. They solved all those problems. Nobody's fixing nothing these days. Well, come on. Like you say, you see stuff happen right in front of you that it's like, wait, no, you can't do that. And like you say, you see it, unfortunately, in every sport. You can see it in the NBA, you can see it in Major League Baseball, you can see it in the NHL, you can see it in boxing, you can see it in the UFC. You pick a sport and you've seen it where you're just like, wait a second. There's no way you could screw that up that bad unintentionally.
Exactly. It has to be intentional at that point. I was really interested in, and I thought it was just kind of a neat little chapter there where we're talking about equipment failure and about some of the weird instances that have happened during those big games that you feel probably were manipulated. Can you give us some examples of some of those?
Well, I think the biggest one was I think the chapter is mainly about the blackout at the Super Bowl.
Right.
Which just, is unprecedented when you think about it. I mean, especially given the point of that game when it just was the Ravens were running away with that game and they had just returned a kickoff. I think it was the opening kickoff of the second half for a touchdown. And it seemed like that game was done. It was over. The Ravens won. There's no point in even watching the second half of this. And then suddenly the power goes out. Bam! Which is something that never happened in professional sports.
It was amazing. I remember seeing that. It was amazing.
Well, I remember I was actually driving home from a party because my wife had to work the next morning, and I turned on the radio, and there was no broadcast. And I was like, oh, no, this is NFL radio on satellite radio. How do they not have the Super Bowl on? And then all of a sudden, after about 5 minutes, somebody came out. I was like, oh, we've had this power outage and we can't. And I'm like, wait, what? But amazingly, after that happened, which they supposedly put a device into the Superdome's power structure to ensure a power outage didn't happen, which to me alone was just weird.
Right.
Why would you need to do that? Because shouldn't there already be systems in place to do that? Well, supposedly that new thing that they put in completely failed and caused the power outage. And then suddenly, after the power came back on, suddenly the 49ers were reborn and brought that game all the way down to basically a 2-minute, final 2-minute play where the game was hanging in the balance. So suddenly people had to watch to the final end of the game as opposed to cutting out, just after halftime. I'd done research for another book about national emergencies and that sort of thing. Totally different subject.
Mm-hmm.
But there were many warnings and many thoughts of terrorists potentially attacking an sporting event like the Super Bowl. And now here you had the power unexpectedly go out in half of the Superdome, and nobody panicked. Roger Goodell never got out of his chair. Nobody freaked out, like, what's going on here? It was like the NFL knew, all right, we got to do something here. This game's getting out of control. I know it seems weird, but let's throw the power. Let's have a talk with a couple people, and then we'll get this game back going and get it and make it more exciting so people are watching till the end.
Well,
it's really coincidental and really weird.
This is not the same as what you're talking about there. This is more the Lord caused an equipment failure. I was watching, I'm from Cleveland, Cleveland Indians and the Chicago Cubs World Series a couple years back.
Oh, yeah.
And again, that was one of those games where you kind of felt like that might have been a very quick series, but the Indians just kind of kept coming back and kept coming back and kept coming back and took that to a seventh game. And in that seventh game, they were way down early, and then they started to pluck away. They got to the ninth inning, and they were one down. They got the Cubs had their, I believe it was Aroldis Chapman, their all-everything closer comes in, and the Indians hit a home run off of him and tie the game. And at that point, I jumped up off the bed, and I'm screaming, we got him. We got this game. We got him. Aroldis Chapman is literally crying. He's crying because of what had happened. And then the rain started. The Lord caused an equipment failure. And they halted the game for about, 30 minutes, which was just long enough that the Cleveland closer, who had been warming up and was prepared to come in and play, could not come in. And so they had to bring somebody else in. And sure enough, the Cubs get a run in the bottom of the ninth or what have you and end up winning the game. But that was one of those times when I looked up, I literally looked in the sky. It's like, the fix is in. The fix is in against me in the Cleveland Indians. Again, it has nothing to do with what we're talking about here, but it's just one of those weird things. How does it happen right then and there? When the Cubs were broken, the reliever is crying in the dugout, and then the rains begin and says, okay, here, let's reset, and let's try this again. It's pretty impressive.
Well, and that's the thing with sports, and I say that's why I think people keep coming back to it, is because
absolutely.
Even though they see the things go wrong, like it's human-based, like you say, like officiating and that sort of thing, it's always, there's still drama in it. And you really don't know, but it's enough to make you keep coming back for more. And it's a bit of an addiction, I think, for a lot of sports fans, too, that they can't really get over it. And I think the leagues know that if you've been an NFL fan for 30 years, what are you going to do, not watch it next week?
Yeah, I know it is for me. I mean, I've been not only in NFL, I've been a Cleveland Brown fan for most of my adult life. And you watch that, and a couple of years where they're gone completely, and they come back and they're winning 2 games a year, and you still watch. You're glutton for punishment. So we have just a few more minutes, Brian. What I know you'd mentioned about the NCAA in terms of probably just blowing the whole thing up and maybe starting over in a different path. Do you have any type of suggestion in terms of the other professional sporting leagues, boxing or tennis, things like that? Do you have suggestions or things that you think could work towards fixing the fix?
Well, I think the only I think power fans have, if they want to change whatever sport it is. I mean, like if you're a baseball fan and you've seen these home runs that are being hit, and you're like, come on, seriously? these guys are just, leaning out over the plate and just slapping at a ball, and it suddenly travels 350 feet out of the park. And Major League Baseball is sitting there saying, no, we didn't do anything to the baseball whatsoever. Hey, come on.
No doubt.
Again, if you've been watching baseball long enough, this ain't right. There's something wrong. But I think the only power fans have, and it's the hardest thing to do, is to not watch and not consume that product. Because, you can go on Twitter and complain all you want. They don't care. You can call your sports radio station all you want. They don't care. The only thing that really they care about is you showing up, buying a ticket, or you turning on your television and watching that game and seeing how the ratings do. So I think the only power fans have to take back their sports, which is the hardest thing to do, is to not watch them and not buy the hats and the T-shirts and everything else that goes along with it. And then I think the league might get, the point. And I think Major League Baseball, I think they did. I think, back in the day of McGuire, Bonds, and Sosa, I think fans realized something's wrong. These guys are taking steroids. There's something up. And I think when Bonds was so blatant about breaking Hank Aaron's records and that sort of thing, that fans did kind of rebel and did stop watching, except for those in San Francisco. But they did, and I think that's what finally made baseball go, wow, maybe we do need to clean up this steroid thing.
Yeah, you're right.
Then fans came back, and then everything was cool. But I think that's the only power fans have, is to basically stand up and say, we're not going to watch your crap until you fix it.
Yeah, you're right. I don't think that Major League Baseball would have given one iota if they hadn't been so blatant about just destroying it. It was a record that had stood for so long, and some people had gotten close, but not really. And then McGuire, not only he doesn't go 62, right? He goes 70, and then Bonds 2 years later or 3 years later goes 73, and it was so incomprehensible that they kind of had to do something about it at that point. Again, it's one of those things that it's like that L.A. New Orleans penalty. It was so blatant that they had to do something about it on the face.
Well, and it helped too that after that penalty, like in the Saints game, Saints fans didn't watch the Super Bowl. I mean, the ratings for the Super Bowl in New Orleans last year were incredibly low because so many Saints fans were ticked off. They decided not to watch them changing the rule, even though they didn't really fix it. But I think that stood up and made the NFL take notice. I think it really did. But that's what they had to do, was not watch and make it noticeable that they weren't watching.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, again for joining me today. You're providing a truly unique view on the topic, for sure.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me, Pete.
No, thank you. Again, if you're interested in finding more about Brian Tuohy, his internet address is thefixesin.net. Again, he has several books on the topic, from The Fix Is In, Larceny Games, A Season in the Abyss, and the brand new one here, The Fix Is Still In. More Corruption and Conspiracies. The Fix Is Still In. But again, go online and check him out and buy the books. They're fabulous. And again, Brian, I know you had mentioned the government disaster response book and the conspiracies regarding that as well. I'm also incredibly interested in talking to you about that at some point. If you're interested, maybe we can put that together as well. That'd be great. So you wanted to say before we go?
Not really. I mean, like you say, I just think for fans, you have to. What I really want them to do is, I don't want them to necessarily stop watching. I just want them to change the way they consume this product. I want them to be more educated about what it really is. And my argument is it's not sport in the pure sense of the term. What it is it's an entertainment entity that happens to produce a sport, and that's their product they're selling you, is their game. And if you realize it's a big multi-billion-dollar business, and if it is just entertainment and really not much different than watching a movie or watching, Temptation Island or the Kardashians or what have you, if you consume it in a different mindset and take your fan hat off, a lot of this stuff, I think, becomes way more obvious to you, and it really changes the way and the importance you put on sports in your life. And that's what I'd like to see happen, is people just pay attention in a different way.
And I know that you can definitely do that, because I remember when I was a kid, professional wrestling still, at that point, kind of gave the illusion of being real, and that to me anyway. And then they've gone completely away from that, where now they all know the script. They all know, these people are playing multiple roles. They know it's entertainment, and people are still, and they've embraced it, and they still go. They still go to the stadiums. They're still cheering, and they understand that it is entertainment now, more so than it used to be much. So I think it can be done for sure.
Yeah, and like you say, I think there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, everybody needs an escape. So I got no problem if you watch sports. I just don't want you to be the boneheaded, fan that thinks this is all on the up and up and it's all real and it's life and death to you.
No doubt.
I think that's where the problem lies.
Understood. Well, thank you again, Brian. I appreciate it, and we hope to talk to you again on the Prove Me Wrong podcast.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So once again, that's Brian Tuohy. He is the author of several books regarding sports fixing. And again, if you are interested more in his information, you can contact him at thefixesin.net. That's his internet address. You can find him there and look up his books and purchase them again. If you have any questions for us here at the Prove Me Wrong podcast, you can contact us through email. The email address is provemewrongcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook. Prove Me Wrong is the Facebook name, on Instagram. And if you're just looking for content, you can find us on the podcast app, Spotify, Tunein Radio, SoundCloud, iTunes, really anywhere that you find podcasts, you can find the Prove Me Wrong podcast. And before we take off, let me finish up today by saying that this episode of the Prove Me Wrong podcast has been brought to you by ZendoZones citronella burners from JT Eaton. They are shaped like fearless little tiki gods, and so let Surfin' Stan, Hawaiian Howie, and Luau Lily bring the islands to your backyard with ZendoZones citronella burners. ZendoZones uses 3% citronella candles and incense cones, perfect for patios, decks, backyards, campsites, poolside, and more. You can enjoy the outdoors again. They are available now on Amazon and at Ace Hardware. Collect them all today. So once again, for Brian Tuohy, this has been Pete Lieb in the Prove Me Wrong podcast, and we'll talk to you again soon.